There is a saying among old soldiers that the body forgets glory long before it forgets duty. Bartholomew Ness had forgotten a great many things in his 81 years. He had forgotten the names of half the men he'd served alongside, forgotten which knee gave him more trouble on rainy mornings, forgotten what it felt like to move without the low, constant ache that lived in his shoulders now. But he had not forgotten how to stand at attention. He had not forgotten the particular weight of a training blade in his palm. And he had not forgotten, not for one single day in 30 years, the faces of the young ones he had trained to die for people who would never know their names. He lived alone at the edge of the city, in a narrow house with a leaking roof and a garden. He no longer had the strength to keep properly. The coat he wore was plain and gray and patched at both elbows. The kind of coat that made shopkeepers glance past him without seeing him at all. He liked it that way. After the life he'd lived, invisibility had become a kind of peace. The city itself belonged to the virile, an alien species, with skin like brushed pewter and eyes that shifted color with their moods, deep violet when calm, a hard amber when angered. They had come to this world 3 generations ago, not as conquerors but as refugees, fleeing the collapse of their own dying empire. Humanity had taken them in. And in the strange, slow way that only decades can produce, a portion of humanity had ended up serving them, guarding them, standing at their gates in the dead of night while the virile nobility slept soundly above. Bartholomew had been one of the architects of that service. Not a guard himself, not exactly. Though he had worn the uniform once, long enough to earn every scar he carried, he had become something else, a teacher. The old virile word, for what he did, translated roughly as Blade Father, though he never let anyone call him that to his face. For 30 years in a training yard behind the old barracks, he had taken frightened young recruits, human and virile both, and turned them into the ceremonial guard, the sworn protectors of the royal line. He had trained the previous king's entire personal detail, every single one of them. That had been 11 years ago. The king had died of old age peacefully in his sleep, and Bartholomew had wept at the funeral like he'd lost a son, because in every way that mattered, he had. The guards he'd trained had scattered into new postings after that, promoted, reassigned, some retired, some still serving in the palace, under whatever title the new administration saw fit to give them. Bartholomew had not seen most of them in years. He did not expect to. That was the nature of the work. You poured yourself into someone until they didn't need you anymore, and then you let them go, and you were glad, and it still hurt. He filled his days with small things. He fixed the fence. He read old books with cracked spines. He fed the birds that gathered on his windowsill, scattering crumbs with hands that trembled now more than they used to. He did not think of himself as forgotten. He thought of himself as finished. There was a difference, he told himself, though some mornings it was hard to remember what the difference was. Then, on a gray afternoon, 3 weeks before the coronation of the new young queen, a courier in gold-trimmed livery knocked on his door and handed him an envelope sealed in wax the color of a virile sunset. Bartholomew turned it over in his hands for a long moment before opening it. He did not get letters. He got tax notices and the occasional apology from a plumber running late. This envelope was heavy, the paper thick and expensive, embossed with the royal crest. Inside was an invitation to the coronation ceremony of Her Highness Queen Athesa Volcaric, to be held in the Grand Palace, seating reserved for distinguished guests of the crown. He read it 3 times before he let himself believe it was real. He did not know, could not have known, that 6 young nobles of the virile court, bored and cruel in the particular way that only the very comfortable can be cruel, had gone digging through old palace registries for a joke to play at the expense of the incoming queen's stiff new protocol officer. A joke about who exactly counted as a distinguished guest of the crown. They had found the name Bartholomew Ness listed in a decades-old barracks roster, described only as retired instructor, human, no title, no rank, no distinction worth noting. They had laughed about it over wine. They had pictured an old man in rags shuffling into the most sacred ceremony in the virile calendar, gawking at the splendor, embarrassing himself in front of ambassadors from a dozen star systems, while they watched from the gallery and congratulated themselves on their wit. They had sent the invitation as a prank. Bartholomew did not know any of that. He only knew that someone, somewhere in that palace, had remembered his name after all these years, and had thought to invite him back. He wept a little alone in his kitchen, and then he was embarrassed at himself for weeping. And then he pressed his one good shirt with an iron that took 10 minutes to heat, and he polished his single pair of proper shoes until they gleamed. And he told himself, quietly, that he would not shame the memory of the men and women he had trained by looking like the ruin the years had made of him. He did not have a proper suit any more. He had not needed one in a decade. So he wore the plain gray coat instead, the patched one, because it was clean and it was his. And because some part of him, some old and stubborn part, thought that if the palace wanted to see who Bartholomew Ness had become, they might as well see him honestly. The morning of the coronation was bright and cold, the kind of high, clear sky that made the palace spires look like they'd been cut from glass. Bartholomew arrived early on foot because a carriage cost more than he had to spare, and because his legs, stubborn old things, still carried him where he needed to go, however slowly. The palace gates rose before him like the walls of a small mountain, carved from pale golden stone, banners of the royal house snapping in the wind. He had walked through those gates 1,000 times in his life, in a uniform, with purpose, with a rank that meant something. He walked through them now in his patched coat, an old man with an envelope in his hand, and he felt every one of those 1,000 walks pressing down on his shoulders at once. The first guard he approached at the checkpoint was young Vero, sharp-eyed, clearly new to the posting. The guard took the invitation, glanced at it, glanced at Bartholomew, and did not bother to hide his amusement. "Distinguished guest," the young guard said, reading the words like they were a punchline, which, as far as he understood it, they were. He waved Bartholomew through with a smirk and a comment to his fellow guard that Bartholomew pretended not to hear, something about the crown really scraping the bottom of the barrel this year. Bartholomew said nothing. He had endured worse than a smirking child in a uniform he hadn't earned the weight of yet. He walked on, down the long processional corridor, past marble pillars taller than any tree, past tapestries depicting battles he remembered fighting, past 100 strangers in silks and jewels who did not spare him a second glance. He was, by every appearance, exactly what the young nobles had wanted him to be. An old man out of place, small beneath the grandeur, easy to laugh at. And then the first guard at the inner hall turned to look at him properly, and everything began to change. The guard was older, seasoned, standing rigid at the entrance to the second courtyard, spear held at a precise diagonal that Bartholomew recognized instantly, because he had corrected that exact grip in 1,000 young hands over 30 years. The guard's eyes passed over Bartholomew's face the way eyes pass over any stranger. Then they stopped. Then they widened. The guard's spear came up to his chest in a salute so sudden and so sharp that the crack of his heels against the stone floor echoed off the courtyard walls. "Instructor Ness," the guard said, and his voice cracked slightly on the words like a much younger man's voice might, though he had to have been in his 40s. His face lined with the particular weariness of a career soldier. "Instructor, I didn't know they'd invited, I didn't know you were coming." Bartholomew blinked at him. It took him a moment to place the face beneath the years, beneath the gray creeping into the temples, beneath the scar along the jaw that hadn't been there when Bartholomew had known him. "Rennick," he said slowly, and the guard's face broke into something raw and grateful. "You remember me," Rennick said, and there was so much in those 3 words, so much held breath, so much old hope, that Bartholomew felt his throat tighten. "I remember all of you," Bartholomew said. It was the truth. It had always been the truth. He remembered every single hand he had shaped a grip for, every single fear he had talked down in the dark hours before a young recruit's first posting. Rennick did not step aside so much as fling the courtyard gate open, waving Bartholomew through with the reverence of a man ushering royalty. And Bartholomew walked on, a little more steadily now, though his mind was beginning to spin with a slow, disbelieving question. He had told himself this invitation was some kind gesture from a palace administrator with a long memory. He had not expected to be recognized. He had not expected to matter. The second guard further down the colonnade saluted before Bartholomew had even fully entered his line of sight, some instinct or whispered word from Rennick having traveled ahead of him. The third guard, stationed near the fountain court, actually stepped down from her post, which Bartholomew knew for a fact violated every protocol he himself had drilled into her, and clasped his hand in both of hers, murmuring, "Instructor, instructor, is it really you?" before catching herself and snapping back into position, cheeks flushed with the shame of having broken formation, though Bartholomew only smiled and told her that of all the rules he'd ever taught, that one had always been his least favorite anyway. Water moved through the palace faster than Bartholomew moved through it. By the time he reached the Hall of Reflections, a long gallery that led toward the coronation chamber itself, the guards were no longer waiting to notice him. They were watching for him. 2 Virel sentries at the gallery's entrance turned in perfect unison the moment he crossed the threshold, spears snapping to their chests, heads bowed at an angle, Bartholomew recognized as the deepest mark of respect. In Virel military tradition, reserved traditionally only for the royal family itself, an old woman in the crowd of gathered nobles, dressed in shimmering court silks, turned to her companion and asked, in a voice not quite as quiet as she thought, "Who is that man, and why are they saluting him, like he's the queen's own blood?" Bartholomew did not answer her, because the question was not meant for him, and because he did not entirely know the answer himself. He only knew that the ache in his chest, the one that had lived there since the old king's funeral, since the guards had scattered to their new lives without him, was beginning to loosen for the first time in 11 years. He passed a full contingent of the inner guard near the base of the grand staircase, 12 soldiers standing in formation, chosen, he would later learn, specifically for the honor of flanking the coronation dais. Every single one of them had trained under him. Every single one of them recognized him instantly. And in a breach of protocol so severe that the young protocol officer nearly fainted watching it happen, all 12 of them broke formation entirely and turned to face him, snapping into salute as one single unified motion, the sound of 12 spears striking 12 chest plates ringing out through the marble hall like a peal of bells. "Instructor Ness," their captain said, and Bartholomew recognized her too, a small Virel girl. He remembered teaching to hold a blade steady despite trembling hands, now a woman with silver rank markings on her shoulder, and an authority in her bearing that made his chest ache with pride. "We didn't know. If we'd known you were coming, we would have arranged an honor guard. We would have." "It's all right," Bartholomew said quietly. "I didn't expect any of this either." The captain studied his face for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted from surprise into a slow, dawning fury, the amber creeping into the edges of her violet eyes. "Instructor," she said carefully, "may I ask how you receive your invitation?" He held up the envelope a little sheepishly, as if presenting evidence in a trial he didn't yet know he was part of. She read the plain, unremarkable listing on the formal seating manifest attached to the back. Distinguished guest, no title, no rank. No distinction worth noting, and Bartholomew watched her jaw tighten in a way he recognized from 30 years of watching young soldiers try to control their tempers in front of superiors. "Someone is going to answer for this," she said, very quietly, and there was iron beneath the quiet. Bartholomew did not fully understand yet what she meant. He did not yet know about the 6 bored young nobles laughing over wine 3 weeks earlier. Yes. He only knew that something had shifted in the air of the palace, some current running beneath the surface of all this splendor, and that wherever it led, he was no longer walking through it alone. The captain, whose name he now remembered was Sella, insisted on escorting him personally the rest of the way, and word of that alone seemed to ripple ahead of them like a stone thrown into still water. By the time they reached the outer chamber of the coronation hall, a small crowd of guards, human and Virel both, had gathered near the entrance, not on duty, simply present, drawn by whispers passing mouth to mouth through the corridors. "Instructor Ness is here. The old man is here. He came." An older man near the back of the gathered crowd, gray-haired, leaning slightly on a cane of his own, pushed forward through the others with a kind of desperate urgency, and when he reached Bartholomew he did not salute at all. He simply embraced him, arms wrapping tight around the old instructor's shoulders, and Bartholomew felt the man's frame shaking. "I thought you died," the man whispered against his shoulder. "I heard nothing for years." "I thought you died, and no one told me." Bartholomew held him back, gently, patting the man's shoulder, the way he might have patted it 30 years ago after a hard training session. "Not yet, Corvin," he said. "Not yet." Corvin pulled back, wiping at his face with the back of his hand, laughing, despite the tears. The particular laugh of a man embarrassed at his own emotion and entirely unwilling to apologize for it. "You look exactly the same," he said. "Older, but exactly the same." "I've gotten slower," Bartholomew said. "Haven't we all?" Corvin said, and the small crowd around them laughed, a warm ripple of sound, and for a moment Bartholomew Ness, in his plain patched coat, stood in the center of a gathering of the most elite soldiers in the virile royal service, and every single one of them looked at him like he was something precious. It was Sella who finally asked the question that had been building since the seating manifest. "Instructor," she said, "why would the crown list you as a nobody? You trained half the guard standing in this palace today. You trained the last king's entire detail. There isn't a soldier serving the royal family over the age of 40 who doesn't owe you their skill, if not their life." Bartholomew was quiet for a moment. "I don't know," he admitted. "I assumed it was simply how records work. After enough years, names fade from files. That's normal. That's what happens." Sella's eyes had gone fully amber now, and around her, several of the other guards' eyes had shifted the same way, a visible current of anger moving through the gathered crowd, like weather. "That is not what happened here," she said, "and I intend to find out exactly whose decision this was." She did not have to look very far. The 6 young nobles responsible for the invitation had, in fact, come to watch their joke unfold in person. They stood near the gallery overlooking the main processional route, dressed in the elaborate layered silks of the virile high court, sipping pale wine, waiting with barely concealed anticipation for the moment the shabby old human would wander lost and humiliated into the ceremony, providing them an afternoon's entertainment before the real business of the coronation began. They had not anticipated the guards. From their vantage point in the gallery, they watched, with slowly draining confidence, as guard after guard broke composure to salute a man in a patched gray coat. They watched captains abandon formation. They watched an old veteran embrace him like a lost brother. They watched, with growing unease, as a crowd gathered around him that included nearly every senior officer scheduled to stand watch over the Queen's own coronation. One of them, a young lord named Velith Kor, laughed nervously and said, "Surely they're mistaken. Surely that's not the same man from the registry." But even as he said it, his voice had lost its earlier confidence, because the resemblance was unmistakable, and because he had, after all, been the one to select the name from the files himself. Precisely because it seemed so unremarkable, so safe to mock. It was Sella, in the end, who found them. She did not need to search hard. Guilt, she had learned long ago in Bartholomew's training yard, has a particular way of standing very still and hoping not to be noticed. And the 6 young nobles in the gallery were standing very still indeed. She approached them with the crisp, contained fury of a woman who has spent decades learning to control her anger and channel it into something far more effective than shouting. "I understand," she said, her voice pitched precisely for them, and no one else, "that one of you selected the guest list editions for today's ceremony." Velith Kor opened his mouth to deflect, to deny, to do any of the small cowardly things people do when caught, but Sella continued before he could. "I am going to explain something to you," she said, "and I want you to listen carefully, because I do not intend to explain it twice. The man you invited as a joke personally trained me. He personally trained Rennick at the outer gate. He personally trained Corvin, whom some of you may recognize as the head of the Queen's own private security detail. He trained the entire personal guard of the previous king, every single one of them, without exception. Every soldier standing watch in this palace today, who is over the age of 35, learned how to hold a blade, how to read a threat, how to put their body between danger and the people they swore to protect, from that man. You did not invite a nobody to humiliate. You invited the reason any of us are alive to stand in this palace at all." The color had drained entirely from Velith Kor's face by the time she finished. "I didn't know," he said weakly. "That," Sella said, "is precisely the problem. Word of the confrontation, reached the new young queen herself before the ceremony had even properly begun, carried by a flustered protocol officer who did not know whether he was more afraid of the guard's anger or the queen's reaction to hearing about it. Queen Ithessa Volkarik was 23 years old, newly crowned and all but the formal ceremony still to come, and she had inherited from her grandfather, the old king Bartholomew had wept for at his funeral, a fierce and particular reverence for the soldiers who protected her family. She had grown up around men and women who spoke of their old instructor in hushed, grateful tones, who told stories of a teacher who had once talked a terrified 16-year-old recruit through his first night watch by simply sitting beside him in silence until dawn, who had personally sewn a wound shut in the training yard rather than send a promising young cadet home for a scar that would have ended her career before it began, who had never once in 30 years raised his hand to a student, not even the difficult ones, not even the ones who deserved it, because he believed that fear taught obedience but respect taught loyalty, and loyalty was the only thing worth having in a soldier's heart. She had heard his name 100 times growing up. She had simply never expected to meet him. When she heard what had happened, she did not send for the 6 young nobles to be punished quietly, behind closed doors. In the bureaucratic way, such things were usually handled. She did something far more effective. She sent for Bartholomew Ness to be brought immediately, not to a side chamber, not to a private audience, but to the coronation dais itself, before the ceremony began in full view of the entire assembled court. Bartholomew, standing in the crowded outer hall surrounded by the soldiers he had trained, felt his stomach drop when the summons arrived. "I'm not meant to be part of the ceremony," he told Sulla, a note of genuine alarm entering his voice for the first time all day. "I was invited to watch. That's all. I don't belong up there." Sulla looked at him with an expression that was equal parts affection and disbelief. "Instructor," she said, "with respect, I think you may be the only person in this entire palace who still believes that." He was led protesting quietly the entire way, through the grand doors of the coronation chamber itself, a vast hall of soaring columns and colored light pouring through stained glass windows, depicting the history of the virile people's arrival on this world, their long exile, their long healing. The chamber was packed with nobility ambassadors from a dozen worlds, and rank upon rank of the ceremonial guard, standing at perfect attention along the walls. Every single guard in that chamber turned to look as Bartholomew entered. And every single one of them, without a word being spoken, without any order given, dropped their spears into salute. The sound was like thunder rolling through the hall, hundreds of weapons striking hundreds of chest plates in a single unified crash, and the assembled nobility, who had come expecting pageantry and ceremony, fell utterly silent, stunned by the sight of an old man in a patched gray coat walking through a corridor of saluting soldiers toward the dais, where the young queen stood waiting. Velith Kor and his 5 companions stood frozen near the back of the gallery, their wine forgotten, their faces the color of old ash. Queen Ithessa descended 2 steps from her throne to meet Bartholomew halfway across the chamber floor, a breach of protocol so significant that a collective gasp rippled through the watching nobles, because queens did not descend to meet guests, guests ascended to meet queens. That was the order of things. She did it anyway. "Instructor Ness," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the vast silent hall. "My grandfather spoke of you often. He said, you gave him the only soldiers he ever trusted completely with his life and with the lives of his family. He said that whatever safety our house has ever known, we owe in no small part to you." Bartholomew, standing before her in his plain gray coat, felt suddenly and acutely aware of every one of his 81 years, of the tremor in his hands, of how very far he was from the young instructor who had once stood in a training yard shaping fear into discipline and discipline into courage. "Your Highness," he managed, "I only ever taught them what they already had in them." "That is not what they say about you," the queen replied. And there was a fierce warmth in her voice that reminded him, with a sudden ache, of the old king's own bearing. "They say you saw something in each of them before they saw it in themselves. They say you never once let them believe they were less than capable of greatness." My grandfather told me that the day he chose his personal detail, he simply asked you who among the recruits you would trust to guard your own life. And you gave him 12 names without a moment's hesitation. Every single one of those 12 served him faithfully until the day he died. Bartholomew's throat had gone tight enough that he could not immediately answer. I understand, the queen continued, her voice hardening now, turning toward the gallery where Velithcor and his companion stood trying very hard to become invisible. That you were invited here today is a cruel joke, by nobles who assumed a man in a plain coat, with no title beside his name, could not possibly be someone worth the court's respect. The silence in the chamber had a texture now, sharp and expectant. I want to correct that assumption, the queen said, loudly enough that her voice carried to every corner of the hall. Effective immediately, Instructor Bartholomew Ness is granted the formal title and standing of Grand Blade Father of the Realm, a rank that has not existed in this court in 3 generations, reserved historically only for those whose service to the crown is considered beyond ordinary measure. He will sit not among the distinguished guests today, but beside the throne itself, as is his right. A murmur swept through the assembled nobility, but it was not a murmur of protest. It was something closer to relief, the sound of a court, realizing, collectively, that an old and obvious wrong was finally being made right. Bartholomew, standing very still in the center of that vast chamber, found that he could not speak at all. Your Highness, he finally managed. I never asked for a title. I know, the queen said gently. That is precisely why you deserve one. She turned then to address the gallery directly, her eyes finding Velithcor and his 5 companions, with an ease that suggested she had known exactly where to look before she'd even begun speaking. As for the 6 of you, she said, and her voice had lost every trace of warmth, you believed a man's worth could be measured by the cut of his coat and the title beside his name on a registry. Wah! You will spend the next year assigned to the training yards, under whatever instruction the Grand Blade Father sees fit to give you, learning precisely what that coat represents. Perhaps by the end of it, you will understand the difference between a nobody and a man, simply too dignified to demand recognition he had already earned 100 times over. Velithcor, to his credit, did not argue. He bowed his head, and beside him, his 5 companions did the same. And if there was any relief among the nobles watching, that the punishment had been a year of hard lessons, rather than something far more severe, it went unspoken. The ceremony proceeded from there in the manner ceremonies do, crowns and oaths and ancient words spoken in the old Varel tongue. But Bartholomew, seated in a chair of honor beside the throne that had not existed an hour earlier, found that he remembered very little of the ritual itself. What he remembered, what he would remember for the rest of his life, was looking out across that vast chamber and seeing, in every rank of guards standing along the walls, a face he recognized. A young woman he'd once talked through her fear of failure at 15 years old, now a decorated captain. A quiet, serious boy who'd struggled with his footwork for months before something clicked, now standing at the queen's own shoulder as her personal shield. Rennick at the gate. Corvin, with his cane and his tears. Sella, fierce and precise, watching the ceremony with the particular satisfaction of a woman who has just set something crooked back onto its proper foundation. He had spent 11 years believing he had faded from their lives, the way old teachers fade from the lives of grown students. A fond memory, nothing more. He understood now, sitting in that chair beside the throne, that he had never faded at all. End quote. He had simply stopped being able to see what he had built because he had been too far away from it, too alone in his small house with its leaking roof, to notice that the thing he had spent 30 years shaping was still standing, still strong, still faithfully doing exactly what he had taught it to do. After the ceremony concluded, after the ambassadors and nobles had filed out in their silks and their finery, the guards did not leave. Dozens of them, then more than 100, gathered in the vast emptying hall, around the old man in the plain gray coat, and for hours long after the sun outside had shifted toward evening, they told him stories. They told him about postings and promotions, about the family some of them had started, about the small ways his old lessons had saved their lives or the lives of people in their charge over the years since he'd last seen them. Corvin told him quietly, near the end of the evening, that he named his youngest son Bartholomew, though the boy went by Bart because it seemed a smaller thing to carry, and the old man wept properly then, without any embarrassment at all. Queen Ethessa herself found him still sitting there as the hall emptied into candlelight, and she sat beside him for a while without speaking, the way, he would later think, a good student learns to sit beside a frightened recruit on his first night watch, simply present, simply there. "I have one more request," she finally said. "Not an order, a request." Bartholomew inclined his head. "Come and teach again," she said. "Not because we need more soldiers, because we need more teachers like you. There are boys and girls in that training yard right now who will spend their whole careers without ever learning what you taught an entire generation before them, unless someone like you is there to teach it to them." Bartholomew looked down at his hands, at the tremor that lived there now, at 81 years of a body slowly giving up its old strength. "I'm not what I was," he said. "Neither was my grandfather." "By the time I knew him," the queen replied. "And yet everyone in this hall still salutes his memory." Bartholomew was quiet for a long moment. Then slowly he smiled. The first real smile he had allowed himself in longer than he could remember. "I suppose," he said, "an old blade can still teach a young hand where to cut, even if it can no longer swing as far." "That," the queen said, "is exactly the kind of thing my grandfather always said you'd say." He returned to the training yard 3 days later, not as an instructor of record, not with any formal duties beyond what his old body could manage, but as something the Queen's proclamation had named, correctly, the Grand Blade Father of the Realm. He sat on a low wooden bench at the edge of the yard most mornings now, watching young recruits stumble through the same drills he had drilled into 1,000 hands before them, occasionally rising, slowly, leaning on a cane he had finally, grudgingly allowed himself to need, to correct a grip, to adjust a stance, to tell some frightened 16-year-old, Cuman or Varel. That fear was not a failure. That fear simply meant you understood what was at stake, and that the only thing that mattered was what you chose to do with it. He wore the plain gray coat, still, every single day, patches and all, because it was his, and because he had learned in the vast Coronation Hall, with 100 guards saluting his name, that dignity had never lived in the fabric at all. It had lived, the entire time, in exactly the place it had always lived. In the quiet, patient work of teaching someone else how to be brave. The 6 young nobles served their year in the training yard exactly as promised, and if the stories from the palace afterward were to be believed, every single one of them left it a different person than they had entered it, though none of them in later years ever spoke of the old man's methods without a certain reverent shudder. Bartholomew Ness lived 7 more years after that coronation day, and every single one of them, he would say, was the richest of his long life. He died in his own bed, in the small house with the leaking roof, which had by then been repaired by no fewer than 4 separate captains of the guard who refused to let their old instructor sleep beneath a broken ceiling. He was buried with full military honors in a ceremony attended by 3 generations of the guards he had trained, standing in perfect unified ranks, spears raised in one final salute, and at the head of the procession walked Queen Ethessa herself, who ordered that the words on his gravestone read simply, in the old Virel script beside the human lettering. He taught us where to stand. If you enjoyed this story, and you'd like to hear more tales of quiet heroes discovering just how much they were always worth, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you never miss the next one. Let me know in the comments, which moment hit you hardest, the guards saluting one by one, or the queen stepping down from her own throne to meet him halfway. Thank you for watching, and until next time, keep your eyes on the stars.